What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of my favorite stories in gaming. So a few things to mention right off the bat here. Obviously, there are, of course, amazing stories all throughout gaming, and 5 is a pretty short list. And to that end, I might eventually do more of these videos and talk about more games, but today these are the ones I felt like talking about, as, of course, these stories and how much we enjoy them is an incredibly subjective thing. Even the stories themselves might not mean the same thing to me as they do to someone else, for instance, which I think is a big reason that games with amazing stories tend to draw a lot of praise exactly for that, their stories. As I've played games that were honestly terrible games but had amazing stories, and I've played games with poor stories that had amazing gameplay. So on that note, let's talk about some games with amazing stories. But obviously, spoilers for all of these games. There should be timestamps as well as a list in the description if you want to check out exactly what games I'll be spoiling so I don't surprise you with them. But with no further ado, let's actually jump into this. First and foremost, Greedfall. I enjoyed the story of Greedfall quite a bit. It tackles colonialism in a sort of high fantasy setting, which is really only something I've seen in this game and a CRPG, Pillars of Eternity to Deadfire. And the combination of colonial age technology and high fantasy and just all of the colonialism going on is a very interesting blend that creates a very unique type of game that you don't exactly see a lot of. So that piques my interest in and of itself. But the actual narrative I thought was especially interesting, as they managed to bring in some of your choices with companions as well, which will then affect the story and change the outcome pretty drastically. Probably the main thing here is depending on your relationship with your personal bodyguard who works for a sort of mercenary faction. He may or may not alert you to an incident that's about to take place where there's a sort of coup that is attempted that you can actually avert by making the proper decisions up to that point, coupled with you kind of watching your cousin's slow descent into madness to this disease is just really cool. I liked the story of Greedfall quite a bit. Now that brings us to our second entry, and that is Baldur's Gate 1. I cover a ton of isometric CRPGs, and I liked Baldur's Gate 1's story so much I did an entire story series about it. Honestly, the entire story of Baldur's Gate 1, 2, and Throne of Bhaal is really good, but my favorite portion of it is honestly Baldur's Gate 1. Sarevok, as a villain who is the main antagonist and actually sort of your half-brother, is just a fantastic villain who has this sort of elaborate plot to start a war with a neighboring city-state to attempt to become the new Lord of Murder, because the old Lord of Murder was, of course, you and Sarevok's father. Now, I like Baldur's Gate 1 in particular because I prefer a sort of low-level approach to things. While it is definitely a chosen one type of story, it always feels very grounded because of the relatively low levels that you achieve during that campaign, meaning there's not really a point where you feel all-powerful despite definitely being a chosen one, and it just feels like a very grounded story. And while I enjoy the story of the second game, it takes the higher level D&D stuff and becomes a bit more of a power fantasy in the traditional sense. And honestly, the combat of the AD&D system back then really didn't handle high-level combat very well. There was a lot of counter magic and dispelling that had to be done. So you combine the preference that I have with that system being the lower levels on top of just the story that I like in Baldur's Gate 1 with a sort of mostly standard hero's journey. I've always really appreciated it in that regard. But that brings us to number 3 on our list, and that is none other than the God of War reboot. Now this one's on here purely because honestly I'm a sucker for dad and son stories these days. As a father myself, I've found that in the years since my son has been born, these stories manage to get me every single time. And in this game, we see Kratos bonding with his son Atreus as they bring his mother's ashes to the top of Jotunheim to spread them as per her last wish, which was just an incredibly touching story to me as a dad. So I admit this one's on here kind of purely for my own sentimentality, but that's part of the experience of stories. I think different themes speak to us as we age and grow, and this is a story I can honestly say that when I was 16 or 17, I just would not have cared about. And now it gets to me every time. But But that brings us to number 4 on our list, and it is none other than Red Dead Redemption 2. This is, of course, a prequel to Red Dead Redemption, so we kind of know how it was going to end before it actually started. But what I really enjoyed about this story in particular was watching Dutch kind of fail and lose control of his gang and this grip he had over their sort of lifestyles and outlook on the world. And the game does a really fantastic job of showing you Arthur Morgan slowly losing faith in his leader and questioning why they're doing the things that they're doing. And to quote the man himself, there's always another train, isn't there? Which, combined, of course, with the themes of redemption, as the title of the game would tell you, I thought it was pretty touching, honestly. I was a big fan of it. Especially that sort of last ride moment you get towards the end of the game, where you're riding to what you know is likely to be Arthur's final moments. And of course, I have to mention the justice of Arthur Morgan beating a man with tuberculosis to death and catching tuberculosis himself in a sort of karmic retribution. Thought that was a nice touch. But that brings us to our last entry on this list, and it is none other than Planescape Torment. I've talked about this previously, but I think Planescape Torment is a fantastic example of a game with a great story and pretty bad gameplay. The Enhanced Edition kind of helped out a bit with this, which definitely helps a lot in that regard, to be clear. But the best thing about Planescape Torment, as I'm sure many people have heard, and honestly probably heard it from me even, is that Planescape Torment has an amazing story, because it does. I especially love the ending where we see the Nameless One sort of walk into the Blood War and accept his fate, as he has lived countless lives and wronged countless people, and has brought torment to everyone around him who are then suffering from their own brand of torment, which of course become your companions. Now, I do think the game suffers a little bit towards the end. The last act or so is quite rushed in comparison to the rest of the game, which came down to development costs. There's a well-known reason for that specific thing, which on top of the gameplay issues makes it to where, unfortunately, outside of YouTube videos, a lot of people don't actually hear about the story of Planescape Torment unless they just happen to have already played it. It's not a game new people are playing a lot of. However, and rather luckily, I think, you can just straight up buy a book of the game, which is certainly a way to experience it if you can't put up with the game itself these days. But one way or the other, I think the story of Planescape Torment is really something people should experience. Very obviously, it's one of my favorite stories in gaming, but there is a list of 5 games with stories that I really enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed the video, but as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, 5 is a very short list for games with amazing stories. So to that end, let me know in the comments down below games you've played with amazing stories that meant a lot to you. I'd love to hear about them, and I'm sure other people would love to discuss it with you. So to that end, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.